Well, today we are brought to the entrance of an empty tomb. As Deacon Rodrigo just proclaimed, the linens were wrapped up, and we don't quite know what to make of these things. This morning, the reality of that empty tomb confronts us. I've celebrated Mass inside the tomb, and I assure you, it is quite empty. The reality of that empty tomb and the knowledge that Jesus is alive, that he is the Lord of everything, empowers us to see the world and our own lives like never before. Easter, if you think of it, is fantastic in its simplicity. I think that's why belief in the resurrection of Jesus has come down to us to this day, precisely because of how powerful this message is in its simplicity. The early disciples, Jesus' friends, were just so taken with the fact that he was still with them. As you can imagine, they had pretty much given up all hope. But there he was, standing right before them, greeting them in the usual familiar way. Salem, shalom, peace be with you. So happy Easter, everyone. It took some 40 days or so to get here, and even though we've done this before, for some of us many times, the mystery of the resurrection of Jesus can haunt us. It is absolutely central to who we are as believers. Yet the mystery of this day, of this week, really, it confounds us. At the same time, without our assent to this fundamental truth, St. Paul teaches us that our preaching without it is in vain. Without the resurrection, our faith is worthless. So this is big. Lent is finished. Easter has burst upon us. Here in our little world of space and time and matter, history and people and real life, Easter bursts upon us. Unfortunately, our minds and our imaginations are too small to contain it, because the resurrection doesn't really fit into the possibilities that we already know about. At one level, the fact that the disciples struggled with all of this, to me, that's a mark of the authenticity of Easter. I mean, who would have made up that detail that the cloth had been placed, which had been placed over Jesus' head, was folded up in a separate place? I mean, you just don't make things up like this. Or next weekend, we'll hear the extraordinary experience of the doubter Thomas sticking his fingers into Jesus' wounds. He did that, or Jesus invited him to do that to counter his persistent incredulity. I mean, who could possibly have prepared for this mysterious development, the resurrection? It's almost as if the gospel writers, the evangelists, were struggling to describe something for which they simply didn't have adequate language. Today, perhaps we find it easier to speak of spring flowers and painted eggs and the Easter bunny because we have not the words or the ability to wrap our minds and hearts around the truth of Easter. However, being disciples of Jesus requires us to try, because the resurrection of the Lord is what gives our lives framework, our living meaning and hope. And so here we are to worship him. Easter is about real life, not escapist fantasy. Easter is about God's judgment on this world and a new glorious creation of freedom and peace. We are meant to live in this new world, in the kingdom of God. Easter is true on the deepest of levels. And it helps us to come to grips with the greatest challenge in life, and that is death. A challenge that we simply cannot avoid. There is no doubt in my mind that Jesus is alive. This is no ghost story, friends. We contemplate today a reality. We have credible testimony from eyewitnesses who actually saw Jesus. These are testimonies to the real Easter. The empty tomb includes nothing at the same time that was all that fantastic. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the resurrection wasn't supernatural. It most certainly was. Mel Gibson, as you might have heard, is working on a sequel to his movie about the Passion of the Christ. And this new movie will actually attempt to chronicle the events of Easter. I don't know how he's going to do it, because in fact, as far as we know, there were no, or at least very few, special effects. The stone, for example, that sealed the tomb, it wasn't cracked in two by lightning. It was just moved away. The inside of that cave where Jesus was buried wasn't glowing with radiant heavenly light. It was, as the gospel writer tells us, dark as they peered in. The burial cloths, as we know, were just there. They weren't ripped to shreds, or they weren't seared by fire. They were just there. Almost like an empty cocoon. And then there's that other cloth that had covered Jesus' head, just neatly folded up off to the side. Simply amazing. Simply amazing. My point is, we get a distorted view of Easter if we impress our fantastic imaginings upon the risen Lord. Oh, he's alive, all right. I'm convinced. I'm convinced because I've come to know him. And the tomb is empty. I'm certain of it. You have your personal story, your family story, your personal history as much as I do. We are together moving forward on a journey of faith that began at our baptism. We are coming to know the risen one. I think that's why Good Friday moves us each year so deeply, because it is our dear friend who has suffered and died. But because we've been gifted really, this supernatural faith in baptism, we know deep down that Jesus is alive. He's with us, here, and always, as he promised. None of this is to say, however, that the resurrection doesn't challenge us. Even this Mass that we offer here on this altar is a challenge to our faith. To quote a familiar Catholic hymn, what the senses fail to fathom, let us grasp through faith's consent. We rely on faith. By it, we know why that tomb is empty. We know who rolled up that cloth neatly. It was and is the same Jesus who feeds us with his risen body and blood. The key to coming to find in Jesus the risen Lord, our dear friend, is to know him as such. Our dear friend is with us right now. He loves us in our brokenness. He accepts us in our weakness of faith. I believe that the resurrection is the best reason of all to get up in the morning, to work so hard to raise your kids, to deal kindly with those around you. Jesus is the reason that we study, to work, to forgive our enemies. He's the reason that we take care of our elderly parents. He gives us reason to handle our bad days and to live well with those we love and to treat with respect those we don't. That's just daily life. And then there's death. Death for us is inevitable. Who knows? This could be our last Easter on this world, in this world. Face death we must, but thanks be to God, we face it in the light of this Easter candle, what happened that first Easter has great implications for us, because by dying, Jesus Christ has destroyed the eternal character of death. And by rising, he has restored our life. Thank God we have our faith. In a moment, we will renew the promises made at our baptism to live it, to live that faith as an exciting journey. Get to know better this dear friend of ours, because he is alive. He is truth. He is the way to make sense out of life. And in the end, Jesus is our only hope. Happy Easter.